All right, I'll just say, everybody, thank you for getting on. But most of all, thank you to Jim for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us this evening. So Jim Dunlap, take it away.
All righty, looks like we have about 25, 26 people on. And so I'll get started if people join. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them anytime through the presentation. This is not some I gotta stay on a staccato kind of rhythm. I can handle the questions on the fly. And so just unmute yourself and ask the questions. So I was asked to present a little bit of overview and training on the initial management inquiry process, because that seems to be very pervasive in our day-to-day operations these days. What is a Pub 5, what falls into Pub 552 and what doesn't fall into Pub 552. And so I am one of your Western Vice Presidents on the national board. And my day job is I'm the manager of labor relations in Colorado, Wyoming. So I deal with these every day because labor relations is now the proponent for oversight of the Pub 552 and the workplace environment intervention systems, which is, as all the other titles, is a mouthful for saying that we're responsible for helping you investigate situations that really rise to the level of a Pub 552 investigation. So I'll start really with a little bit of an overview and background. So most of us are familiar with Pub 552, the employee's version of that for their rights and responsibilities, Pub 553, and what is affectionately called the IMIP, or Initial Management Inquiry Process. And there's a lot of confusion about what triggers or initiates an IMIP. Or we see so many grievances and employees say, I want a Pub 552. My supervisor harassed me. He asked me to finish my route in 8 hours today. I gave him a 39.96, asking for 3 hours of overtime. And he said, not only am I not giving you 3 hours of overtime, I got an hour split for you to fill your day. And he looked at me cross-eyed when he said that. I want to file Pub 552. Well, the reality is that a Pub 552, an IMIP, is the first two steps of a Pub 552. And a Pub 552 is truly for situations that involve threats of assault or bodily harm, sexual assaults or sexual misconduct, and anything that rises to the level of a violation of treatment relative to the ADAA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so there were 7, there are now 9 protected classes within that ADAA scope. And I'm going to use a couple examples, and please allow a little bit of license to try to formulate an example. If I am a supervisor and I'm going around and talking to my employees and negotiating their performance for the day, and I say, Sally, I really need you to get done in 8 hours today. I know you're a slow carrier. You're not the best carrier I have, but I know you can do it. So I'm not approving your 39.96 today. That doesn't rise to the level of an investigation or an initial management inquiry process. It doesn't even really rise to the level of a conduct under ELM 650 or Article 16. But if I come around and I say, you know, Patty, you are just so fat and lazy, you couldn't get your job done if you tried, and I just think you need to get out there, and a younger carrier could get it done, that absolutely would rise to the level of an IMIP, and I would be in the wrong. So there's really a fine line, and many of the requested investigations really fall to the idea that somebody's behavior or conduct was wrong, just wrong. Raising one's voice, profanity on the workroom floor. Those are investigated under Article 16, and they don't really rise to the level of a management inquiry. So let's see if I can get this to advance using my slide. Oh, no. Oh, I have to make it full screen. Sorry. Now it will act like a thing. So if you were to open the Pub 552, Publication 552, the actual handbook, and get through all the general definitions in the introduction, you would get to this graphic. And this graphic basically delineates the 6 steps used in pursuit or processing an IMIP. And steps 1 and 2 are the immediate supervisor or immediate manager. So this really applies to our frontline postmasters and our frontline supervisors. And what triggers an IMIP? An IMIP is triggered by a complaint levied by either an employee or a fellow supervisor or manager. And somebody's not on mute, last 4 digits of their phone, 0188. Okay, so what really triggers that is a report of a situation by either an employee or a fellow EAS manager that, and somebody else is not on mute, that's 2455, the last 4 digits of the phone number. And so that report of a complaint from an employee or a fellow EAS to their manager that describes an event that either involves a racial, ethnic, religious, gender, age, identity slur, or a sexual assault or sexual harassment, or a physical threat of harm. Whether it's believed to be imminent, whether it's believed to be just an ideation, or whether it really truly is somebody is vocalizing a threat. And so once that comes to a person, either verbally or in written format, they immediately have to act. That's our obligation in response to what will come as an EEO or be processed through the EEO chain for that harassment. And our response is an immediate and complete and equitable enforcement of investigation and correcting the behavior. So if you read these bullets under number 1, respond promptly. If approached with a harassment complaint or a situation, schedule a meeting immediately with that person who is raising the allegation, raising the complaint. Review all of the relevant information with them. Review with them these policies and procedures, and I have a whole series of publications from the Postal Service, including Poster 107 and Poster 108, that I can send you out, and then review with them the procedures. Look, Sally, Bill, I'm going to get your information. I'm going to get your information. I'm going to have you also transfer your verbal complaint into a written statement and sign and date it. And then I'm going to investigate it locally, and I'm going to involve my next higher level manager, and we're going to investigate it to get to the full picture of allegations, so that when we submit the allegation to the LR manager, we have a summary of what has happened thus far and how far we have gotten into the investigatory process. You have to advise them that there's confidentiality. A lot of times people are hesitant to refer something to management or to make that complaint because they're afraid of retaliation, or they're afraid that it'll become scuttlebutt or rumor mill, and that their peers or their friends will treat them differently because they raised a question. You let them know that the responsibility is on management to investigate, but it's also their responsibility to not then create that rumor mill by sharing that information with a variety of people and a variety of versions of the story. And you let them know their rights. They have a right to file an EEO, a harassment claim against the individual, and if it's a craft employee, it's truly against the postal, it's against Louis DeJoy on behalf of Postal Service for a specific situation. And they have 45 days from the date they became aware of the event or incident to file that online EEO. It's just like eComp has gone online for all accidents. There is an online EEO complaint process. And then you've got to garner their trust. You've got to talk to them about if it's a situation where there's an ongoing sexual harassment or an ongoing intimidation and bullying situation, that you're going to move the alleged harasser temporarily to allow for an unimpeded investigation of the situation. So in that initial meeting with them, you're gathering a written, signed statement, and you're advising them of the process. And there's actually a script for it right on the early pages of the Pub 552. Then you're going to obtain some information from them. You're going to identify, okay, well, you've explained to me the issue. Where did it happen? How did it happen? When did it happen? Who was around that may have witnessed it? What was the specific nature? Was it inappropriate sexual jokes? Was it a racial slur? Was it a gender slur? Was it a physical assault? Was it a physical sexual contact, a sexual assault? And you're going to identify the safety issues. You're going to immediately report it to your next higher level manager, and they will involve the HR manager and the labor relations manager. Advise them that we have EAP. Advise them that they have a right to file an EEO within 45 days of the incident. And then, like I said, confer with this still says the HR manager, but that all has changed in the restructuring to the LR manager. In the new structure, the HR department handles hiring. That's all they handle. Hiring. The training department handles training. Safety department handles safety, and HRM handles OWCP, but labor handles everything else. And then you're going to go and you're going to interview those witnesses, and your final interview is going to be with the alleged threat maker or the alleged harasser. And you will take those, and I'm going to page down here. You will take those two steps and you will review them with your postmaster or PUM and make a determination locally. Is it a conduct issue that needs to be addressed either through Article 16 or ELM 650? Or is it a true harassment or inappropriate behavior that needs to be addressed with a more in-depth investigation? And that summary comes to the HR manager and the LR manager, and we confer together. If it has a threat, if there's a threat component, we involve the threat assessment team, which includes a postal inspector, the safety manager, the EAP coordinator for the district, and where needed, the district manager, senior plant manager, or senior operating manager responsible for that area. And then we make a determination. Is there truly a threat? We prioritize it 1 through 4, 1 being significant, imminent threat, vocalized target, and the employee has the means or the track record, the criminal history that it could be truly a threat, or down to a level 4, which is no threat, no vocalized target, no means to accomplish it, and no indication of imminent action. And so we make those determinations at the TAT if it's a assault situation. And we make those determinations from the recommendation of the postmaster and the supervisor. And there are times that the postmaster or supervisor will say, no, I want an external team to come in here and investigate and talk to every single one of my employees. Okay, that's called a climate survey, and that's a whole different process, a whole different workplace intervention, and probably wouldn't be involved in a singular complaint. But if you have 5 or 6 or 8 employees complaining about the same supervisor, or 5 or 6 employees complaining about the same group leader if they're mail handlers, lead clerk if they're clerks, or fellow carrier, then that could also be handled locally, or it could also be referred for further investigation. So once we've done steps 1 and 2, and we send it to LR to make a determination, and LR decides that the circumstances require a full-fledged fact-finding and an IMIP to be conducted, 2 members, 1 male, 1 female from the district roster of individuals who are trained will come in and conduct much more in-depth interviews with every one of the witnesses, and any witness that's identified through their questioning of the witnesses will also get interviewed. And it can be a cascading domino effect that gets to 30 or 40. And Sharon, it looks like you're not on mute. And so it could get to 30 or 40 interviews. And those will all be gathered. A summary will be completed. And from that summary, a course of action will be developed. And that course of action usually is developed with the occupational health nurse in those situations that involve medical, the EAP coordinator with those situations that involve a mental state of mind or a potential mental component, and then the safety manager. And so, and if it's a threat situation where there's been a vocalized threat or any indication of a weapon, then the inspection service will be involved, have a special agent on that panel. And we will take that information and determine a course of action. And we'll report that course of action back to the operating manager responsible for that area, whether that's the PUM or the postmaster. And that might involve movement of the alleged harasser or alleged threat maker. It might involve a continued emergency placement. I'm going to take a minute here and interject that if you have physical contact between 2 employees or between a management employee and a craft employee, both employees immediately are emergency placed to let the situation cool down, put them in their timeout chair, send them home to take a breath, and immediately schedule them to come back for their next scheduled duty day. If it's a craft employee, for an investigative interview. If it's an EAS, you will have already made a concurrence with the PUM that they have to potentially be relocated to another office until a full investigation has been able to be conducted. Or you may actually even emergency place an EAS employee. Generally speaking, EAS employees, if they are emergency placed, if it's done to immediately avoid a threat of violence. They will probably go out on leave without pay, but not to exceed 14 calendar days. If it's going to exceed beyond that 14 calendar days, they must be placed in administrative leave. The same thing applies if it's a veterans preference employee. And veterans preference for EAS really doesn't make a lot of difference, because if you supervise 2 or more craft employees or supervise 2 or more employees, you're already going to be covered by MSPB, and those are the rules that are covered by MSPB. So I'll jump back into, so in the process, we've sent in a team and they've gathered a great deal of information. And having done 20 or 30 of these now in the last couple of years, I can tell you the picture develops pretty clearly in those interviews. Unfortunately, there's oftentimes tangential information that comes up in the middle of those interviews that sends you down a side rabbit hole for a little while, might even lead you to another person to have to investigate as a result. And the situations are absolutely countless. There's just no accounting for the amount of crazy and weird things our employees across 650,000 employee organization will do. It's flabbergasting. And so once we get through with that information from the IMIP, we get through with those interviews and we develop a course of action, that course of action will be documented in a system that's called WETS, Workplace Environment Tracking System. And it will be measured at its progress, whether that recommendation was for corrective action for both employees. Common IMIP. Billy and Sally are boyfriend, girlfriend. They're both rural carriers. They break up. Now they keep hurtling rocks and arrows at each other on the workroom floor in the way of inappropriate commentary. And we end up in an IMIP. Both of them will get potential for corrective action. They're really, in those situations that take 2 to tango, there really isn't purely an aggressor and a victim. There's usually an antagonist and the person who got caught, who overreacted. But there's really an antagonist and a reactor. And oftentimes both parties share culpability. So most of the time, if there's physical contact, both parties will be emergency placed, injurious to self or others. And for rural carriers, that's Article 16.5. If for city carriers, clerks, and mail handlers, that's Article 16.7. And for EAS, that's 651 of the ELM. And so they get separated. But too often we send them out on emergency placement and we say, wow, what a peaceful unit it is without Billy around. And we forget to bring them back and follow through with the action plan. And then Billy gets paid for 4 months of administrative leave on back pay, plus any overtime he missed because we kept him out long after the emergency was over. So you have to follow up on those. It takes an inordinate amount of managerial time to address those situations. And it takes a lot of effort, and you have to be consistent. You can't enforce the rules with Billy and not enforce the rules with Joe, or enforce the rules with Betty and not enforce the rules with Sally. You have to be consistent across the board, even if it's your best carrier, your best clerk. All right, so.
Can I ask a question, Jim?
Yes, ma'am.
Relating to, I know you're just talking about craft employees being out, but what about a situation, because I've heard of postmasters that get put on administrative leave, and I've heard of some situations where they've been out longer than a year. Can you explain like why those types of circumstances?
Okay, so yes, you're absolutely correct. And there are times that there is a provision that we can, that senior management can put an EAS employee out immediately into a non-duty paid status. So they're on administrative leave right from the first day they're out. Usually those are about inappropriate sexual relationships in the workplace. And there is not a clear understanding of the depth of the situation to be able to just move that EAS to another facility to work. So if there is a thought that that employee could be inappropriate with other employees at another location, then we would put them out on administrative leave until the investigation could be completed. I have seen investigations take as long as 18 months. I have seen investigations take as short as 4 to 6 weeks. It really depends on the complexity of the situation, the depth, the layers that have to be peeled back to get to the truth, and the resources that are available to do that. A lot of times in those kind of situations, like that would lead to a year long, they involve the inspection service, oftentimes the inspection service and the OIG, as well as multiple tiers of investigation, because there is one level higher than a Pub 552. It's within the scope of the Pub 552, but there's one level higher than a formal IMIP, and that is a formal external fact finding. And those folks come in and set up camp in your office and will interview your employees and observe the workplace and evaluate your stamp stock if it had anything to do with pilferage, or evaluate the employees who have been current employees and previous employees. So those can get pretty in depth, and it could take longer than a year. Yes. We try not to, but it could.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So then we get through with all those interviews and questions. One of the things we advise them is that sometimes we get these complaints that come to us not from an employee directly, but from the EEO process, where they have filed a workplace harassment, a workplace retaliation, or a workplace discrimination charge or allegation, and the intake specialist reports it up their chain, and then the managerial control in EEO gets hold of, through the law department usually, the inspection service of the OIG or the senior manager responsible for that area, usually the district manager or the senior plant manager. And they immediately look to see whether there was a lesser charge with that employee involved, a lesser investigation with that employee involved previously. And that's the whole purpose of the WETS database, the threat assessment control team database, and the workplace environment tracking system are mirrored databases. They have similar fields and they interlink in some fields. And they're there for those external entities to be able to evaluate whether Sam Smith is routinely involved in these kind of situations, and for the law department to determine what kind of liability has Sam Smith been creating for the Postal Service because we've allowed him to continue to behave in that manner. And so they sort of work all together with the EEO intake department, the legal team from the law department, usually the employee law office, either west or south, or west or east, and labor relations and HR. So it's kind of a tangled web, which is probably why it's confusing to a lot of people. So claims for serious harassment or serious hostile work environments and threats of physical violence, those intake specialists are required to report those to their next higher level, and those next higher level managers are required to pursue those and ensure that there is a record of the incident, because unfortunately employees who participate in those kind of situations, oftentimes it's not a one-off situation. They have done it before, or they'll do it again. And so they want to have a way to track that. So we've gone through and we've gotten the IMIP report. There's actually a formalized report. It's right in the appendix of Pub 552. It's also available in typable PDF forms, which are like in a template format where you can type in the highlighted areas. The only problem with the typable forms is they are pre-programmed. They are pre-programmed to adjust the font to fit what you write in the space. And if you happen to write like Jim Dunlap emails, long, full sentences, paragraphs with appropriate punctuation, you tend to end up at a 2 pica print level. So you have to be real careful and go to a continuation page or just see attached and do it on a Word document to begin with, because it will get pretty small pretty quick. And again, they're available typable. They are all in the back of the Pub 552. The Pub 552 is available in the more references off of the blue page, and you can call it up. And again, most of the time you're gonna type it on an attached Word document instead of in those grayed areas, but it is a template and allows you to type in there. And there's actually a format for the summary that goes to the HR manager and LR manager. And then we fill out. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Do the people who are on the IMIP investigative team, do they make the summary, or do they just send up their notes and someone else makes the summary?
They make the summary. So that's part of that two-part review process. That's part of that two-part review process. So there's a summary. There's a summary from the people who did the IMIP, actually did the interviews. And then there's a summary produced by the HR manager, LR manager, as we review the case and come up with a recommended course of action. And oftentimes that course of action will involve the law team or the OIG. So, and every district recently has had the opportunity to send people to IMIP training or Pub 552 training. And we have shared those training seats across the area. So I sent people to Washington State and to Utah to participate in some training, and some of those states sent people to mine. But I try to maintain a roster of between 28 and 35 people who are formally trained for IMIP and threat assessment, TAT. And I maintain that roster on an Excel spreadsheet, and I try to identify when people are used so that I can see that the same people aren't always being pulled out of their office, because that has been the number one problem is in this time of post-COVID hiring drought. It has been hard to get managers to be willing to release a postmaster or a manager or a supervisor from their unit to go and participate in an IMIP, especially if it's cross PUM into another PUM group. So I try to make sure that each PUM group has 4 or 5 that are trained, and then I try to keep people retire and transfer and get jobs and leave all the time. So I'm forever rotating people into that training and out. And it only comes up a couple or 3 times a year, the formal training. So last year they did about 8 sessions in different locations of train the trainer sessions, so that each district has about 6 or 8 people who are trained as train the trainer. so that they can train up some replacements as people leave. Because you always need one male and one female on every team. And so then we will take that and we'll put it into WETS. And the data fields, I have created a data sheet for my district that I send them, and I say, don't send me an indication that you have an IMIP or a threat assessment that you can't fill out every data field on this sheet. And it's actually a front and back. And so there's about 26 data fields they have to be able to fill out, because that's the bare minimum information that I need to put it into WETS. And if you put it into WETS and you don't have the complete data, it will let you save it, but it will send you an email at midnight every night for every vacant field that has a red asterisk beside it. And it will kill you with system-generated emails reminding you that there's data missing that you can't seem to get from the frontline unit that did the initial investigation. So I tell them, when you finish your investigation, you need to be able to put some sort of data in each one of these fields on this data collection sheet, so that I have the data to enter it, because it is really very frustrating to try to save it when it's and it doesn't accept unknown or not applicable, because every one of those particular data fields has a reason for being there and a reason that they want the information. Basically, in every single thing we do, whether it's an accident package, whether it's a serious accident review board, whether it's preparation for a grievance, whether it's preparation for the issuance of discipline, or investigating a threat assessment or a harassment situation, we need the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And that's really very important, because those first initial investigators are going to paint the picture that is going to determine what depth and level of resources are provided to an issue to resolve it. And it's really bad when that resolution comes 6 months later from an EEO judge, and they award the employee $135,000 because management did not respond sufficiently or quickly enough with enough depth of action plan to address a situation. And that costs us a lot. We spend a lot in EEO payouts. And I see somebody put something in the chat. I'm going to try to. Yep, and I will send out anybody who wants those typable templates or the template for the summary. I will send that out. I will make that available to anybody who wants it. And then part of the process is reporting back to the alleged harasser and the alleged harassee what the outcome of the investigation is. You might go back to both and say, it was inconclusive, not enough information available. It's a he said, she said. So I'm going to put you both on notice. You got to act like adults in an adult professional work environment. Or it might be unsubstantiated, meaning that there was all these allegations about harassment by a supervisor, and then when the investigation on the supervisor concluded, it was determined that they might have a personality that only a mother could love, and some days she might question that. But they really weren't doing anything outside the scope of their duties. They just have a really rough personality. And so we might give them some training on interpersonal skills, or to hone their soft skills on how to manage people and how to manage for success, or how to drive to yes, how to get to the point where that carrier accepts the fact that their demonstrated performance is what you're using to tell them that today they have less mail than they had yesterday, and yesterday they got it done in 8 hours. So today they might not feel great, but they still have to get it done in 8 hours. And sometimes the carrier doesn't want to hear that. So it might be unsubstantiated. And then ultimately there could be those, and there will be some, there will be more than half that will be substantiated. And then those will be a course of action that will either lead to an investigative interview with a union steward present, or an investigative interview with a chapter member rep present for investigating the actual situation that occurred. And there will be some that involve a court hearing on the criminal aspect of the case as well. And those we will want to get our law department involved, just because they keep us out of hot water, and by getting them involved, it maintains the client attorney privilege of the information that is exchanged in the development of the course of action.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
So there's a situation where I'm at where a group of disgruntled employees got together, wrote a letter, say 7 to 10 people signed it, sent it straight to HR and labor. IMIP team comes out, the allegations against the postmaster in this case. So during the interview with the postmaster names witnesses that can refute some of the things that were said, but none of those witnesses were ever talked to. Now that postmaster's had their first II over this instance. What's their recourse?
Well, certainly their recourse is our representation. So I put on my one hat, our representation, and the way we push back on management to conduct that investigation more thoroughly. And then putting on my day hat is going and talking to those investigators and determining, okay, the allegation has been made that there were 3 witnesses brought to your attention that you didn't interview. Your obligation and the instruction that you were given when you went out to conduct this investigation was to conduct a thorough investigation that also involved interview of any named witness from either side. And so I would say that it's an incomplete investigation until those witnesses have been interviewed. And if I were their chapter member rep, I would be pushing back on that next higher level manager, that PUM, and say, look, there's an incomplete investigation. There are still witnesses that were named that were not interviewed. Until they've been interviewed, you can't move forward with this action. It's not a complete and thorough investigation. And so I will challenge it as a due process violation. Did that help to answer the question?
Yes, thank you. And one more thing, is it typical, and I know it's expedient, but is it typical for one to ask the question and one to record the answers, or should both be recording the answers?
When I go and do them, and I only get pulled in to personally do them when it's a senior level manager, or it's a criminal assault or sexual assault situation. And so when I go in with a partner manager to do those interviews, both of us take independent notes. Both of us keep our notes, and then we confer at the end of all of our interviews. We confer on all of the information that we have gotten. And there have been times where I wrote something down and didn't hear it or feel it in the same way that my partner interviewer did. And when we sit down and talk through it, we could say, oh, wow, I hadn't even thought of that. I'll give you just a generic out of the blue scenario where in interviewing the female victim of a sexual or an alleged sexual assault. She identifies that he did this, he grabbed me, he ripped my clothes off, he did that. But in interviewing a witness or a person who arrived on the scene after that, who assisted that victim in recovery, they said, well, I went and I got her clothes. They were stacked neatly by the wall. But yet the alleged threat maker, the alleged harasser, was so intoxicated he was passed out on the floor. So it's not likely that he folded the clothes neatly and put them by the wall. That piece of information really changed the light and opened the door to a significant additional investigation into a situation. Now you have potential that there was some mutual concurrence that that relationship was going to occur. So one doesn't necessarily end up with neatly folded clothes along the wall if they've been ripped off in the heat of an assault. And so then it led to additional questions, which led to additional witnesses and people who were aware of the situation, which led to painting a whole different picture of the situation. And so it really is one of those things that you have to go in to do the investigation with an absolute open mind to hear the responses to the questions and follow the evidence, and not predetermine, oh yeah, this guy's a pig, he probably did it, or this guy did that. It's you have to follow the evidence where it takes you, and sometimes it takes you in a whole different direction than you think it would have. And that's why I said I would, as a chapter member rep, I would push back on that PUM and say, look, you're headed down an investigation or a pursuit of 650 action, and there isn't a complete investigation yet. There are still 3 witnesses that were named that haven't been interviewed. And push back in that way. And I think if John
So,
Surdich
Jim,
was on, he would agree with me. Yes, Sharon.
this is Sharon. So when are the documents and files, anything used for the results of the IMIP, when are those available to the chapter member rep?
Okay, so there you get into a really fine line right there. So just as we have some protections for medical information when we're addressing RFIs with the union in accordance with Article 17 and Article 31 and the National Labor Relations Act, we get to protect FECA documents and HIPAA documents. So those that are related to on-the-job injuries and those that are related to medical diagnoses and prognoses. A redacted and sanitized version can be turned over of those documents, but it goes through the law office. With IMIPs and Pub 552 investigations, the pure interview notes taken by the investigators or the interviewers of the actual harasser, harassee, and witnesses are not surrendered. The summary and the course of action is. There is a point in time in the discovery process in a court hearing in EEOC where those can finally be compelled to be shared, but it's in the formal court of law.
So to know who was already, who was interviewed and who wasn't interviewed, can the PUM say, oh, well, we got a statement from them, we spoke with them? I mean, how does the chapter member rep prove that everybody that should have been interviewed had not been interviewed in order to tell the PUM that investigation is incomplete?
So generally, the way that information is conveyed is the, call them the client, the supervisor on whom the action is being taken says, hey, wait a minute, but Sally and Bill and John haven't been talked to, and I gave them their names in my interview. And then the chapter member rep goes to Sally and Bill and John and says, did anybody ever talk to you about this? And they say, nope. Then you have your answer. If they say, yep, and I gave a statement and I don't really care to have it shared, then they have given you the other answer. So you know that investigation was more thorough and complete. Does that answer the question sufficiently?
It answers the question, but it's not what I want to hear.
Okay, I will buy that. You know, there is lots of things in the post office that don't seem to make real world, real humanity, real life sense. And that's one of them. And I have had several situations where we've asked the law department to redact information so that it's not attributable to the source, so that we can share the allegation. Where you get that shared the most is in workplace climate assessments, where you initially mentioned that this is one postmaster who 6 or 7 or 8 employees got together and signed this joint statement of how bad they were, but then there were 3 or 4 other people who could refute it. And in those situations, we might start with a climate assessment where we come in and interview every single employee with the same 10 questions, and then compile those questions into percentages of response, and then sit down with that postmaster and say, 9 of your employees say this is the best place that they've ever worked. 4 of your employees don't like to come to work because it's hell on earth. And it's more or less a percentage of the respondents who had favorable things and non-favorable things to say on that question. And it really isn't intended to get down into a disciplinary process. It really is intended to find the underlying root causes. Maybe it's a communications problem. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of what the operational expectations are. So there are several things that come out of a workplace climate survey that won't come out of an IMIP. And one of them is the feedback to the manager that's the focus of the survey.
So basically, if an investigative interview has been completed, you don't do anything and say it hasn't been thoroughly investigated until possible disciplinary action is going to be issued, or when it's issued? Or do you say that earlier in the game before discipline
I wouldn't
is
wait.
issued?
I wouldn't wait that long. I would bring that issue up as soon as the client has brought it to your attention, as soon as the represented employee has brought it up to your attention. I would bring it up immediately. Because remember, it's not a snipe. You're not sniping. It's not a gotcha. It's this information has been provided that you missed a piece in the investigation, and I'd like you to rectify that before you go any further. And you know, that chapter member rep can actually have a conversation with the potentially issuing or proposing official that may even change that proposing official's mind on moving forward with any corrective action at all.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so then we're into that, evaluating the information. Then we make a determination, a course of action. Sometimes that'll mean a reassignment of the alleged harasser or the threat maker. Sometimes it will lead to criminal action against the criminal proceedings against the threat maker. Sometimes it will end up in both employees being sat down, maybe even an investigative interview and corrective action to both. I will tell you that generally speaking, the resolution on the grievance for discipline issued to a craft employee in a skirmish between a supervisor and craft employee is oftentimes used as the litmus test for reducing that action on the supervisor in the same way. We wouldn't very often settle a proposed removal on an EAS employee who got in a physical altercation with an employee for a 7-day and return them back to work, a letter of warning in lieu of 7-day suspension, and expect that employee is still going to be removed, because the comparator in their process, in their arbitration, will be allowed to be admitted that, well, I got into a push to cuff with the supervisor. We both got emergency placed. We both got issued notices of proposed removal, but they let the supervisor come back and only gave him a 7-day suspension, but they still want to fire me. And so that will come into play in the grievance process. And it works both ways too. So if the grievant, the craft employee, gets a reduction in their proposed action, then that oftentimes extends to the okay.
Hey, Jim, I have a question.
Yes,
What
ma'am.
recourse does management have, like in Sharon's example, if there were 6 or 7 employees that come and, make up allegations because they're disgruntled, and they go through this process and they end up uncovering that they were false allegations? What recourse does a manager have to take on those employees, or do those employees get disciplined, or how are they held accountable?
So I would caution that manager or postmaster from doing anything that could have the appearance of retaliatory. And the investigation is not really focused on assigning fault to those who came forward with the allegation, as much as it is clearing the name of the person who was alleged to be the threat maker or the harasser. However, there will be things that occur after that situation, the way you laid out that scenario, where those employees they still need to be held accountable for their conduct. So if they're on the floor and they're laughing and joking and telling off-color jokes, that needs to be addressed with a conduct issue. If they have,
yeah, like for instance, they're like, oh, we made up these false allegations, we got this, management person put on, out of the office, then I mean, I just don't see how there's no accountability on their part if it's proven to be false.
Yeah, I think we would have to, I mean, those are the kind of situations that it's hard to talk in what ifs. I think in those situations, we'd really have to get to the brass tacks and see exactly what the allegations were and what the falsification was, or was it an exaggeration in the story or embellishing the story. So those, I think we would talk about on a case by case based on the fact circumstances as a result of that, a specific case. That it's hard to talk about that in a generality of
Right. I understand it's
might be able to
complex,
do.
but it just doesn't seem like there's ever accountability for craft employees in these types of scenarios, if it's them basically just coming up with false allegations to be spiteful.
And generally speaking, where there's smoke, there has been a little bit of fire. So it's very rare for either side, for management to make up a story about a craft employee or for craft employee to make up an absolute out of the blue fabrication about a manager or postmaster. But again, those would be fact circumstances that would come to light in the investigation that I think we would be able to address, but those would have to be case by case. So Dan sent me a text there a minute ago to let me know that we were at an hour. And so if there's any burning questions, I'll answer those. You all who know me know that I answer my emails 24/7. You won't ever send me an email that you won't get an answer for in the same day. If it's a work-related issue like this, you can send it to my postal email. I'm james.t.dunlap@usps.gov. Otherwise, if it's a purely UPMA related question, then you can send that to my personal email, jtdpostal@hotmail.com. And I will always entertain any questions on anything. The rest of the slides really just talked about what levels the LR manager will go through in closing out the IMIP, notifying the harassee and the harasser of the outcome, and then preserving the record in the WETS or TAT databases.
So Jim,
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to follow up on the question about, okay, the IMIP investigation is done. And now let's say that there's an OIC in the office and the OIC hears those employees bragging about the fact that they got the manager thrown out because of their allegations. At that point, would it be appropriate for the OIC through the PUM to have would the IMIP team come back to interview those people? Or
It very well would. It would be. I would suggest that the IMIP team come back because they're the most familiar with the situation. But I would also entertain assigning either a higher level district employee or an outside employee from the area, usually area labor, to come in and interview those people.
okay, but there could be follow-up if
Yes.
something like that came to light.
Yes, sir.
All right. Are there any other questions right now? Otherwise, Jim, this was exactly what we wanted to have you cover tonight. You did an excellent job as always. And we really, on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you for your time and your efforts in putting this together and for all of the information that you shared.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm always willing to share anything you need.
Okay. All right. With that, everyone, we will bid you a fond good evening. And thank you again for getting on. As I said earlier, we did record this session and it will be posted on our website sometime in the next few days. So with that, I'm going to close out the meeting. So good night, everyone.
Good night,
Good job,
guys.
Jim.
Thanks, John.